I am Camille Thorne, 32 years old, and until 48 hours ago, I believed that loyalty still meant something in this world. I was wrong. The sound of my heavy suitcase hitting the wet asphalt was the first thing that snapped me back to reality. It landed with a sickening thud, splitting the zipper open and spilling my clothes into the muddy puddle at the end of the driveway. Rain lashed against my face, cold and unforgiving, blurring my vision, as I looked up at the house I had spent the last decade turning into a home. The massive oak double doors stood wide open, framing a scene that looked like a distorted nightmare. Julian stood on the dry, sheltered porch, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, the expensive vintage we had been saving for our anniversary. He looked impeccable in his tailored navy suit, not a single hair out of place, watching me scramble in the mud like I was some sort of entertainment. But he wasn't alone. Brittany stepped out from behind him, wrapping her arm possessively around his waist. She was 23, blonde, and the daughter of one of Julian's biggest investors. She was wearing my cashmere shawl, the one I had bought in Paris, draped over her shoulders, as if it had always belonged to her. She held her phone up the screen, glowing in the twilight, recording me. I could see the red recording dot blinking. Julian took a sip of wine and cleared his throat, his voice projecting clearly over the sound of the thunder. "Read it again, Camille," he shouted, tossing a document onto the wet steps. It was the prenuptial agreement I had signed 10 years ago, back when I was a naive 22-year-old in love with a charming real estate broker. Article 4, Section C. All assets acquired prior to and during the marriage remain the sole property of the primary earner. He laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "That means this house, the cars, the bank accounts, and the furniture belong to me. You were just a guest here, Camille." And checkout time was noon. I scrambled to gather my soaking wet clothes, shoving them back into the broken suitcase. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the handle. "Why are you doing this, Julian?" I screamed, my voice cracking. "I supported you when you were nobody. I paid the bills when you started the firm." "That doesn't matter now," he replied coldly. "You are bad for the brand, Camille. Look at you. You are a book restorer. You smell like old paper and dust. Brittany here, she is the future. She is energetic. She fits the image of a CEO's wife." Brittany giggled, zooming in on my face with her phone. She looked down at me with mock sympathy and said, "Oh, don't look so sad, sweetie. Here." She reached into her pocket and crumpled up a $20 bill, tossing it into the mud next to my shoe. "Call a cab. We don't want the neighbors thinking we are cruel to the help." She then turned the phone back to herself and said to her camera, "Time to take out the trash, guys. New beginnings." The heavy iron gate began to close slowly, the electric motor humming a final goodbye. I watched as the warm golden light from the foyer spilled out onto the porch one last time before the doors slammed shut. I was left alone in the dark, the rain soaking through my thin blouse, chilling me to the bone. I grabbed the $20 bill from the mud, clutching it like a lifeline. It was the only money I had. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding it from the rain. 4% battery remaining. I tapped the banking app, praying for a miracle, but the screen flashed a notification that made my stomach drop. Account locked. Access denied. Julian had moved fast. He hadn't just divorced me. He had financially deleted me. I was alone in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, miles from the nearest bus station, with a dead phone and a broken suitcase. I started walking. The walk to the motel felt like a descent into hell. Every step was a battle against the wind and the humiliation burning in my chest. Cars sped past me, splashing dirty water onto my legs, their headlights blinding me for a second before leaving me in darkness again. It took me 3 hours to reach the edge of the city, where the manicured lawns gave way to cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights. I found a Motel 6 nestled between a liquor store and a pawn shop. The neon sign buzzed ominously, the letter M flickering on and off. I dragged my suitcase into the lobby, dripping water all over the linoleum floor. The night clerk was a man with grease stains on his shirt and eyes that had seen too much. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my ruined designer shoes and the mud streaked across my face. $40 a night, he grunted, not even looking up from his small TV screen. I placed the muddy $20 bill Brittany had thrown at me on the counter and frantically dug through my purse for loose change. I poured out a handful of quarters and dimes, counting them with trembling fingers. "Please," I whispered. "This is all I have. It is $28. It is raining. Please." He stared at the pile of coins, then at me. He sighed, snatching the money. "Checkout is at 10. No guests, no drugs." He slid a plastic key card across the counter. I took it and fled to the room before he could change his mind. The room smelled of stale smoke and lemon cleaner. I collapsed onto the lumpy mattress, not even bothering to take off my wet clothes. I stared at the ceiling, the water dripping from my hair onto the pillow. I had lost everything. My home, my marriage, my dignity. I reached into the inner pocket of my suitcase, searching for something dry to wrap around myself. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled it out. It was the old tin box my father Otis had left me. He had passed away 5 years ago, a humble man who worked the graveyard shift as a security guard for 40 years. I opened the rusty lid. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the card. It didn't look like a credit card. It was heavier, made of thick black metal. There was no magnetic strip, no chip, no expiration date, and no bank logo. Just a string of raised silver numbers and my father's name, Otis Thorne, engraved in small letters at the bottom. I remembered the night he gave it to me, lying in his hospital bed, his breathing shallow. "Camille," he had wheezed, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "This is for you. But you must listen to me. Do not use this for fancy clothes or cars. Do not use this because you want things. Use this only when the world has turned its back on you. Use this when you have no other choice. It is a lifeline, not a wallet." I had nodded, crying, thinking it was just a keepsake, perhaps a commemorative token from his years of service. I had never tried to use it. It seemed ridiculous to think a security guard would have a black card. But now, as the wind howled outside the motel window, I traced the numbers with my thumb. I was desperate. If there was even a chance this card was linked to some small savings account he had hidden away. Maybe $500 it could save me. I grabbed my coat and ran out into the rain again, heading for the gas station across the street. There was an ATM in the corner, its screen glowing blue in the darkness. I inserted the heavy metal card. The machine whirred and clicked, making a sound I had never heard before. I waited, holding my breath. I typed in the PIN code my father had whispered to me that night. 1980. The screen flickered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a message appeared in stark red letters. "System error, code 99. Unidentified credentials. Contact headquarters immediately." The card ejected with a forceful click. I stared at the screen, tears mixing with the rain on my face. It was broken. Or invalid. Of course it was. My father was a security guard, not a millionaire. I was a fool for thinking a fairy tale would save me. I slumped against the cold metal of the machine, sliding down to the dirty ground, and for the first time that night, I let myself scream. The next morning, the sun rose over Chicago, indifferent to my suffering. My stomach twisted with hunger. I hadn't eaten in 24 hours. I packed my damp clothes and left the motel key on the nightstand. I had one asset left: my wedding ring. It was a 1-carat diamond, simple but elegant. Julian had bought it when we were just starting out, before the millions, before the greed. I walked into the pawn shop next door. The air inside was thick with dust and desperation. Behind the glass counter sat a man with thick glasses, examining a watch. I approached him, taking the ring off my finger. It left a pale tan line on my skin, a ghost of the commitment I had honored. "How much?" I asked, placing the ring on the velvet tray. He picked it up, barely looking at it. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe and squinted. "Good clarity," he muttered. "But the setting is dated. The market is flooded with diamonds right now, sweetheart. Everyone is selling." I swallowed hard. It was appraised at $10,000 5 years ago. I just need enough for a deposit on an apartment and some food. "Give me $2,000. He laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "$2,000. You are dreaming, lady. I will give you 300. Take it or leave it. $300. That wouldn't even get me a train ticket to my sister's house in Detroit. It was robbery. But my stomach growled loudly, betraying my pride. I realized I had no leverage. I was a woman with messy hair and mud-stained clothes in a pawn shop at 9 in the morning. I can't, I said, snatching the ring back. It is worth more. I will find a way. I walked out, clutching the ring. I needed a bank. A real bank. Maybe the ATM was just outdated. Maybe if I spoke to a human, they could tell me if there was any money in my father's old account. I checked the address on the back of the metal card. Sterling Bank, Main Branch, downtown Chicago. It was a 5-mile walk. I tightened my shoelaces and started moving. By the time I reached the financial district, my feet were blistered and bleeding. The Sterling Bank headquarters loomed over the street like a fortress of glass and steel. It was the symbol of old money, of power, the very world Julian was desperately trying to break into. I approached the revolving glass doors, trying to smooth down my wrinkled blouse. I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked deranged. My mascara was smudged. My hair was frizzy from the rain, and my eyes were wild with exhaustion. As I stepped toward the entrance, a large hand blocked my path. It was a security guard, tall and broad, wearing a uniform that cost more than my entire outfit. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "This is a private bank. The public ATM is around the corner. We don't allow soliciting in the lobby." "I am not soliciting," I said, trying to summon the voice I used when I managed restoration projects for the city library. "I am a customer. I need to speak to a teller." The guard looked me up and down, his lip curling in disgust. "I don't think so. We have a dress code and you are disturbing the clients. Move along before I call the police." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. "Please, I just need to check a card. It will take 2 minutes." I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. I said, "Move along," he barked, shoving me back. I stumbled, nearly dropping my suitcase. Just as I was about to lose my balance, a sleek silver Bentley pulled up to the curb right in front of us. The valet rushed to open the door. I froze. I knew that car. I knew that license plate. A polished black shoe stepped onto the pavement, followed by a navy blue pant leg. Julian emerged, looking refreshed and wealthy, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Brittany hopped out of the other side, wearing a white sundress and holding a stack of folders. They were here, at Sterling Bank. The universe was playing a cruel joke on me. Julian adjusted his jacket and looked toward the entrance, his eyes landing on me. He stopped, slowly taking off his sunglasses. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for the people passing by to hear. "Look who it is. I didn't know Sterling Bank had a soup kitchen." Brittany laughed, linking her arm through his. "Just ignore her, baby. We have a meeting with the loan officers. We are building an empire. She is just debris." I stood there, humiliated, the guard's hand still pushing me back. My ex-husband laughing at my misery. I gripped the metal card in my pocket so hard the edges dug into my palm. I had never felt so small, so powerless. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. I had nowhere else to go. I watched them walk through the revolving doors like royalty, the guard bowing his head to them. I took a deep breath, shook off the guard's hand, and followed them in. I had one shot, one card, and I was going to play it, even if it was the last thing I ever did. The moment my muddy sneaker touched the pristine white marble of the Sterling Bank lobby, the entire atmosphere shifted. It was a cathedral of wealth with high vaulted ceilings, gold-leafed pillars, and a silence so profound that the squeak of my wet shoes sounded like a gunshot. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, but 2 pairs of eyes burned hotter than the rest. Standing near the mahogany loan desk were Julian and Brittany. They looked like a magazine cover couple, radiating health, wealth, and arrogance. Julian was adjusting his silk tie, and Brittany was flipping through a loan portfolio, but as I stepped further inside, their attention snapped to me. For a second, I hoped they would pretend not to see me. I hoped they would turn back to their paperwork and let me disappear into the background. But Julian never missed an opportunity to perform. He took a step away from the loan officer's desk, his polished shoes clicking confidently on the floor. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. It was the look a predator gives wounded prey before the final strike. "Well, this is awkward," Julian announced, his voice booming slightly in the cavernous space. He spread his arms wide, drawing the attention of the other clients, mostly older men in suits and women in pearls. "I thought we made it clear last night, Camille. The severance package was 0. Are you stalking me now, or are you just here to use the bathroom?" I gripped the handle of my broken suitcase tighter, my knuckles turning white. I kept my eyes fixed on the teller stations at the far end of the room, refusing to engage. "Just keep walking," I told myself. "Just get to the counter." But Brittany wasn't going to let me pass that easily. She stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the tellers. The smell of her perfume and expensive floral scent that I used to wear hit me like a physical blow. She looked me up and down, her nose wrinkling in exaggerated disgust as she surveyed my damp clothes and the mud streaks on my legs. "Oh my God, Julian, look at her," Brittany said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "She looks like she slept in a dumpster." She turned to the security guard who was hovering nearby, unsure of whether to intervene. "Excuse me, officer. Is it sanitary to have her in here? My fiancé and I are signing a multi-million-dollar loan for the Thorne Tower project. We really can't risk catching anything before the press conference." The guard took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am," he said to me, his tone warning, "you need to leave. I am a customer." I said, my voice shaking but louder than I expected. "I have a card. I need to make a withdrawal." Brittany burst out laughing. It was a sharp, piercing sound that made my skin crawl. "A withdrawal. Honey, you pawned your wedding ring this morning for a sandwich. We saw you coming out of that dirty shop on 5th Street. Julian shook his head, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a money clip, peeling off a crisp $5 bill. He held it out to me, pinching the corner as if he didn't want to touch me. "Here," Camille, Julian said, smiling benevolently for the audience of staring bankers. "Go get yourself a coffee, maybe a bus ticket out of town. You are embarrassing yourself, you are embarrassing me, and frankly you are scaring the real customers." I looked at the $5 dangling from his fingers. Then I looked at his face. The face I had kissed every morning for 10 years. The face of the man who had promised to love me until death. In that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud break, it was a quiet, cold shift. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard rage. I didn't take the money, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply walked around Brittany, my shoulder brushing hers hard enough to make her stumble in her high heels. "Hey, watch it!" she screeched, but I was already moving. I marched toward the main teller station, my heart pounding a rhythm of war against my ribs. The teller was a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a name tag that read Sarah. She was watching me approach with wide, alarmed eyes. She had her hand under the counter, likely already reaching for the panic button. She saw a crazy woman. She saw a threat. She didn't see Camille Thorne. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice high and tight. She didn't offer a greeting. She just wanted me gone. I didn't say a word. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out the heavy metal box. My hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore. I opened the lid. The black metal card sat there, absorbing the light of the chandeliers. It looked ancient and alien in this modern temple of finance. I took it out. It was cold and heavy in my hand, dense like a gold bar painted black. Behind me, I heard Julian laughing again. "She is probably trying to cash a library card. Someone call the psych ward." I ignored him. I looked Sarah dead in the eye, raised the card, and slammed it down onto the marble counter. Clang! The sound was louder than it should have been. It rang out like a hammer striking an anvil, a heavy industrial noise that silenced the entire room. Julian's laughter cut off abruptly. The security guard froze. Sarah jumped back, startled by the weight of the object. "I need to access this account," I said, my voice steady and low. Now. Sarah looked at the card with confusion. She reached out tentatively, her manicured nails clicking against the black metal. She flipped it over. There was no magnetic strip, no chip, no holographic logo, just the embossed numbers 000-000-001 and the name Otis Thorne. She let out a scoff of disbelief, her fear turning into annoyance. "Ma'am, this isn't a debit card," she said, sliding it back toward me with 2 fingers. "This is a piece of scrap metal. I don't know what kind of prank you are playing, but I am going to have to ask you to just swipe it," I interrupted, leaning forward. "Or type in the numbers. Just do your job." Sarah rolled her eyes, clearly deciding that humoring me was the fastest way to get me to leave so she could go back to serving the VIPs like Julian. "Fine," she sighed. She typed the strange sequence of zeros into her keyboard, hitting the enter key with an aggressive tap. She crossed her arms, waiting for the error message to pop up so she could call security. I held my breath. The room was silent. Julian and Brittany had walked up behind me, ready to witness my final humiliation. "This is sad, Camille. Really sad," Julian whispered in my ear. Suddenly, the hum of the bank's ventilation system seemed to drop away. A sharp digital chirp echoed from Sarah's computer. Then another. Then a continuous high-pitched siren that seemed to come from the machine itself. Sarah frowned, uncrossing her arms. She looked down at her screen. Her expression went from annoyed to confused and then in a split second to absolute terror. The soft blue light of the banking interface vanished. In its place, the entire screen flashed a deep, violent crimson. It wasn't just an error message. It was a lockdown protocol. The red light reflected on Sarah's pale face. She tapped the keyboard frantically, trying to escape the screen, but the computer was frozen. A robotic voice, quiet but audible in the tense silence, emanated from her terminal. "Priority 1, alert. Clearance level Alpha." Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. The annoyance was gone, replaced by a look of pure bewilderment and fear. The words on her screen were large, bold, and pulsing in white against the red background. "Do not process. Do not decline. Call the director immediately." "What did you do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at the card, then back at me as if seeing a ghost. She backed away from the counter, knocking over her pen holder. Julian stepped forward, looking over my shoulder, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "What is going on? Why is the alarm going off? Is she trying to rob the place?" Sarah didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. She reached for the phone on her desk, her hands shaking so hard she dropped the receiver once before fumbling it to her ear. She dialed a number that I guessed was rarely used. "Director Henderson," she stammered into the phone, her voice cracking. "Sir, I am so sorry to disturb you, but the system, it is the Black Ledger protocol." "Yes, sir. Someone is here. Someone used the founder's key." The entire lobby was now staring. The security guard had his hand on his taser but looked unsure of who to target. Julian and Brittany stood frozen, their mouths slightly open. I stood alone at the counter, my hand resting on the cold black metal of my father's legacy, and for the first time in 24 hours, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the calm center of a storm that was about to tear their world apart. The red light on the computer screen pulsed like a heartbeat, casting a sinister glow over the terrified face of the teller. Sarah pushed her chair back, her hands raised in surrender, as if the small black metal card on the counter was a loaded weapon. The silence in the bank lobby was absolute, broken only by the distant, frantic clicking of heels on the marble floor, coming from the mezzanine level. I turned my head. Running down the grand spiral staircase was a man I recognized from the financial news. It was Charles Henderson, the regional director of Sterling Bank. He was a man known for his ice-cold demeanor and impeccable composure, a man who could crash a stock market with a single frown. But right now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. His tie was askew, his face was flushed, and he was taking the stairs two at a time, risking a fall that would shatter his hip. Julian, seeing the director approach, immediately straightened his jacket. He put on his best winning smile, the one he used to charm investors and intimidate rivals. He stepped forward, blocking Mr. Henderson's path to me. "Mr. Henderson!" Julian boomed, extending his hand. "What a surprise. I assume you are coming down to handle this disturbance personally. My ex-wife is clearly having a mental breakdown. If you need security to remove her, I can—" "Move," Henderson barked. He didn't shake Julian's hand. He didn't even look at Julian. He shoved my ex-husband aside with a strength that shocked everyone in the room. Julian stumbled back, nearly tripping over Brittany, his mouth falling open in disbelief. Mr. Henderson stopped in front of me. He was breathing hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He looked at my muddy clothes, my wet hair, and the dark circles under my eyes. Then he looked at the black cards still sitting on the counter. Slowly, deliberately, this powerful man in a $3,000 suit lowered his head. He didn't just nod. He bowed. It was a deep, respectful bow, the kind a servant gives to a queen. "Mrs. Thorne," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "We have been waiting for you. For 40 years we have been waiting." I stood frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs. "What is happening?" I managed to whisper. "Am I in trouble?" "No, madam," he said, straightening up, but keeping his eyes lowered respectfully. "You are not in trouble. You are finally home. Please, come with me." He gestured toward the far wall where a set of gold-plated elevator doors stood. I had always assumed those doors were decorative or perhaps for maintenance. I had never seen them open in all the years I had banked here. Henderson pulled a key from his vest pocket, inserted it into the call button, and the doors slid open silently, revealing an interior lined with velvet and mirrors. I stepped forward, grabbing my broken suitcase. Brittany let out a shrill, indignant laugh. "Excuse me, where is she going? We have an appointment. You can't just take a homeless woman into the VIP lift while we stand here." Henderson turned. His eyes were cold, hard flints of steel. He looked at Brittany, then at Julian. "The appointment is cancelled," he said calmly. "Cancelled." Julian stepped forward, his face turning red. "Do you know who I am?" "I am Julian Thorne. I am building the biggest tower in Chicago. You need my business. You cannot walk away from me to talk to a woman who pawns her jewelry for lunch money." Henderson pressed the button to close the elevator doors. As the gold panels began to slide shut, blocking out Julian's furious face, Henderson spoke one last sentence that echoed in the small space. "Mr. Thorne, you are a customer of this bank, but the woman standing next to me is the reason this bank exists." The doors clicked shut. The elevator began to ascend, moving so smoothly I couldn't even feel the motion. The silence inside was thick, heavy with unspoken secrets. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked like a wreck. I looked at Mr. Henderson. He was staring at the black card which he was now holding in his hands with a white handkerchief, treating it like a holy relic. "My father," I said, my voice shaking. "He was just a security guard. He worked the night shift. He ate tuna sandwiches and drove a Ford." "Why do you have his name on a panic button?" Henderson looked at me, his eyes soft with sadness. "Otis was not just a guard, Camille. And this is not just a bank account." The elevator chimed. The doors opened directly into a penthouse suite that spanned the entire top floor of the building. It smelled of old leather, expensive cigars, and history. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the very skyline Julian claimed he owned. In the center of the room was a massive oak desk, and behind it a portrait of the bank's founder, Elias Sterling. But next to the founder's portrait was a smaller black-and-white photograph. I gasped. It was my father. He looked young, strong, and he was wearing a uniform. Henderson walked to a large steel safe embedded in the wall behind the desk. He spun the dial, the clicks echoing in the large room. Heavy tumblers shifted into place. He pulled the heavy door open and retrieved a single leather-bound file. He placed it on the desk in front of me. August 14th, 1980. Henderson began, his voice taking on a storytelling quality. It was the darkest day in our history. 4 men with automatic weapons stormed the main branch. They wanted the vault. But mostly, they wanted to make a statement. They lined up the employees. They were going to execute Elias Sterling first. I listened, mesmerized. My father had never told me this. Everyone froze. Henderson continued. The police were minutes away. Elias was on his knees, a gun to his head. But one man didn't freeze. Your father. He wasn't armed with a gun. He tackled the leader. He took 2 bullets to the chest, Camille. 2 bullets meant for the founder of this bank. He wrestled the weapon away long enough for the police to breach the door. He saved Elias's life. He saved everyone. I touched the photograph of my father. He had scars on his chest. He always told me he fell off a fence when he was a kid. Elias wanted to give him a reward, Henderson said. $1 million. But Otis refused. He said he didn't want the money to change him. He didn't want his daughter to grow up spoiled. He wanted you to learn the value of hard work. So Elias created a shadow trust, the anonymous bearer trust. Henderson opened the file. Inside were yellowed documents signed in ink. He granted your father 0.5% of the bank's net profit every single year, deposited into a compound interest account that could only be accessed by this specific metal card. It was designed to remain dormant until Otis or his heir decided it was time. Henderson turned the page to a current balance sheet. He tapped a number at the bottom. We have been investing that money for 40 years, Camille. The market has been kind to us. I looked at the number. I blinked, sure that I was misreading the zeros. I counted them. 6 zeros. 7. 8. $142,400,000. Henderson read aloud. That is your current liquid balance. You are not just wealthy, Mrs. Thorne. You are one of the largest individual cash holders in the state of Illinois. My knees gave out. I collapsed into the leather chair, clutching the armrests. 142 million. An hour ago, I was begging for $300 for a diamond ring. I thought of Julian throwing a $20 bill in the mud. I thought of Brittany laughing at my clothes. But that is not the most important part, Henderson said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Money is power, yes, but control is absolute. He flipped to the final page of the document. It was a single paragraph underlined in red ink. The founder's clause, Henderson said. Because Otis saved the bank, Elias wanted to ensure that the bank would never be used to harm Otis or his family. This card carries veto power. It means that as a silent partner, you have the right to unilaterally approve or deny any high-risk commercial loan issued by Sterling Bank. My head snapped up. I looked at Henderson. Does that include the loan for the Thorne Tower? Henderson smiled. It was a small, tight smile, but it was the first time I had seen him look happy. Julian Thorne is leveraging everything he owns for that loan. His company, his personal assets, even the equity in the house he kicked you out of. The loan committee approved it this morning. The paperwork is on my desk downstairs, waiting for a final signature. I stood up. I walked to the window and looked down. Across the street, I could see Julian and Brittany walking out of the bank looking angry, probably calling their lawyers to complain about the service. They looked like ants from up here, tiny, insignificant ants. I turned back to Henderson. I picked up the black metal card. It felt warm in my hand now. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice steady and cold. I would like to make a withdrawal. And then I would like to review some loan applications, specifically the one for my ex-husband. Henderson nodded, closing the file. I thought you might say that. Welcome to the board, Camille. Mr. Henderson handed me a pen, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. He asked if I wanted to announce my new position to the board immediately. He asked if I wanted to walk downstairs and fire the teller who had panicked. He asked if I wanted to have Julian removed from the building by security. I looked at the pen, then at the skyline of Chicago sprawling out beyond the glass. It would be so easy to cause a scene right now. It would be satisfying to march down there and scream the truth into Julian's smug face. But satisfaction is fleeting, destruction is permanent. And I didn't just want to embarrass Julian. I wanted to dismantle him. I wanted him to build his tower of cards so high that when I finally pulled the rug out, the fall would be fatal. No, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I want total anonymity. My name appears on nothing, not on the public records, not on the shareholder lists. To the world, I am still the broke ex-wife sleeping in a motel. To the bank, I am a ghost. Create a shell company. Call it Otis Holdings. That is the entity that will be dealing with Julian Thorne. Henderson nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. He understood. He opened the safe again and pulled out a heavy leather briefcase. He filled it with stacks of $100 bills, counting them out with the precision of a machine. $100,000 in cash. It was a fraction of my balance, but as he snapped the brass latches shut and slid it across the mahogany desk toward me, it felt heavier than the entire world. I took the handle. It was cool and solid. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding on to hope. I was holding on to leverage. I took the service elevator down to the parking garage, avoiding the lobby entirely. Henderson had his personal driver waiting for me in a black sedan with tinted windows. As the car pulled out into the sunlight, I saw Julian and Brittany standing on the curb arguing with a valet. They looked agitated. Good. I leaned back in the soft leather seat and gave the driver an address. It wasn't a hotel, it was a bridal boutique on Oak Street. Specifically the boutique where Brittany had bought her $5,000 wedding dress just last week, charging it to a credit card that was technically in my name. When I walked into the boutique, the air conditioning hit me like a wall of ice. The shop smelled of lavender and money. I was still wearing my mud-stained blouse and ruined trousers. My hair was a disaster. The sales associate, a tall woman with pinched features and a name tag that read, Klein, looked up from her phone. Her eyes widened in horror. She didn't see a customer. She saw a stain on her pristine white carpet. "Excuse me," she said, rushing out from behind the counter with her hands raised. "Deliveries are in the back alley, and if you are looking for handouts, we have a strict policy against soliciting. Please leave before I call the police." I didn't stop walking. I moved past the racks of tulle and silk, running my fingers over the fabrics. I stopped in front of a mannequin wearing a sharp, tailored white suit. It was structured, powerful, and impeccably cut. It looked like armor disguised as fashion. It was the kind of suit a woman wore when she was done apologizing. "I want this," I said, pointing to the mannequin, "in a size 4. And I need a pair of those Italian pumps in the window. Black." Klein laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Madam, that suit is a limited edition piece from Milan. It costs $4,000. The shoes are another $1,200. I am not going to waste my time letting you try things on just so you can ruin the fabric with your filth. Now get out." I smiled. It was the same smile I had seen Julian use 1,000 times when he knew he held all the aces. I lifted the heavy leather briefcase and set it down on the glass display counter. The glass rattled. I popped the latches. The sound was loud in the quiet store. I lifted the lid. Klein's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes bulged as she stared at the neat rows of Benjamin Franklin's. The hostility drained from her face, replaced instantly by a greedy, fawning desperation. "I am not asking for credit," I said softly, pulling out a thick stack of bills. "And I am not asking for your opinion. I am paying cash. I want this suit. I want those shoes. And I want access to your private dressing room and shower suite. I know you have one for VIP brides. I am going to wash this mud off, and then I am going to walk out of here a new woman. Do we have a deal? Or should I take my money to the competitor across the street?" "Right away, ma'am," Klein stammered, her hands shaking as she reached for the suit. "Right this way. Let me get you some sparkling water." 40 minutes later, I stood in front of the three-way mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. The mud was gone. My hair was slicked back into a severe, elegant bun. The white suit fit me like a second skin, accentuating my shoulders and waist. I looked tall. I looked dangerous. I looked like money. I left my old clothes in a pile on the floor of the dressing room. I told Klein to burn them. I walked out of the store, my new heels clicking a rhythm of war on the pavement. I got back into the waiting car and gave the driver my final destination, the Langham Hotel. It was directly across the river from the Thorne Tower, Julian's headquarters. I walked to the reception desk. This time no one tried to stop me. The concierge rushed to greet me, taking in the suit, the briefcase, and the aura of command radiating off me. "I need the presidential suite," I said, placing my black metal card on the counter. "For the month. And I want the corner unit facing the river." "Certainly, Mrs. Thorne," the concierge said, typing rapidly. "We have availability." "That suite offers the best view of the city architecture." "I know," I said. "That is why I want it." 10 minutes later, I was standing on the balcony of the 35th floor. The wind whipped at my face, but I didn't feel cold. I felt alive. Directly across the river, through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the building opposite mine, I could see into Julian's office. I pulled a pair of high-powered binoculars from my shopping bag. I raised them to my eyes. There he was. Julian was popping a bottle of champagne. Brittany was sitting on his desk, laughing, kicking her legs. He was toasting to his success. He was toasting to the loan he thought he had secured. He was toasting to the destruction of my life. He had no idea that the woman he threw out in the rain was now standing 400 yards away, holding the deed to his destruction in her hand. I lowered the binoculars and picked up a glass of Pinot Noir the hotel staff had poured for me. It was the same vintage Julian had been drinking on the porch. I took a slow sip. It tasted like iron and victory. "Enjoy the champagne, Julian," I whispered into the wind, my eyes fixed on his tiny, celebrating figure. "Drink up. Because tomorrow the hangover begins." I turned back to the room where my briefcase sat open on the bed. I picked up my phone and dialed Henderson's private number. "Mr. Henderson," I said, watching Julian laugh one last time. "This is Camille. Go ahead and approve the preliminary paperwork for his loan. Let him think he has won. Let him start digging the hole. We will wait until he is deep enough before we bury him. Let the hunt begin." The presidential suite at the Langham Hotel had transformed from a luxury getaway into a war room. The dining table was no longer set for meals. It was covered in legal pads, corporate registration documents, and a secure laptop that hummed in the silence of the room. I sat at the head of the table, staring at the screen. In less than 24 hours, I had erased Camille the victim and birthed a new entity. I typed the final command into the offshore registry system. Otis Holdings was officially born. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, designed to be opaque, untraceable, and utterly ruthless. The primary shareholder was anonymous. The registered agent was a law firm that charged $5,000 an hour to keep secrets. To the outside world, Otis Holdings was just another faceless pool of capital looking for high-yield investments. To me, it was the executioner's axe. I picked up the phone and dialed Henderson. It was time to set the bait. "Make the call," I said, my voice flat. I could hear Henderson take a deep breath on the other end of the line. He was nervous, but he was committed. He knew that what we were about to do walked the fine line of corporate ethics, but he also knew that Julian Thorne was a cancer that needed to be cut out of his bank. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I stood up and paced the length of the suite, watching the river flow below. I imagined Julian in his office across the water, probably yelling at an intern or checking his hair in the reflection of his window. Finally, my phone buzzed. "It is done," Henderson said. "Tell me everything I commanded." "He took the bait," Henderson replied, a hint of satisfaction creeping into his voice. "I called him into my office. I told him that due to the sudden volatility in the housing market, the bank's risk assessment committee had retroactively flagged his application for the Thorne Tower. I told him we couldn't finance the $50 million directly. And his reaction? He went ballistic." Henderson chuckled darkly. "He started screaming about suing us. He threw a paperweight across the room. He said he had already committed to contractors and that we were ruining his reputation. He was sweating Camille. He is leveraged to the hilt. If he doesn't get this funding by Friday, he defaults on the land purchase option. He will lose everything he has invested so far. That is when you offered the lifeline, I said. Exactly. I waited for him to calm down, and then I told him that while the bank couldn't hold the debt, we had a private client. A boutique investment firm called Otis Holdings that specializes in distressed assets and high-risk development. I told him they move fast, but they are expensive. Did he ask who runs it? He asked. I told him it is a silent consortium of foreign investors who value privacy above all else. He didn't care, Camille. The moment I said $50 million, he stopped asking questions. He demanded the contact information. He is desperate. He is emailing the full project proposal and the loan application to the secure server right now. Good, I whispered. Send it to me. I hung up. Moments later, my email chimed. The subject line read, Project Thorne Tower, confidential. I clicked open the attachment. It was a massive file, hundreds of pages of blueprints, financial projections, and environmental impact studies. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down to read. I wanted to know exactly what my ex-husband was building. I wanted to see the monument to his ego. The first 50 pages were exactly what I expected. A 60-story glass monstrosity filled with luxury condos that no one in the neighborhood could afford. It was gentrification in its purest, ugliest form. He planned to put a high-end gym on the ground floor and a private club on the roof. It was vanity wrapped in steel. But as I scrolled deeper into the document past the glossy renderings of swimming pools and marble lobbies, I reached the section labeled Site Clearance and Demolition. I stopped. My hand froze on the mouse. The Thorne Tower wasn't being built on empty land. It was being built on a block that currently housed a row of historic brownstones in a small community park. I knew that block. It was on the south side in a neighborhood that had been the heart of the Black community for decades. But Julian had marked all of those buildings for demolition. That was bad enough, but it wasn't what made my blood run cold. I scrolled to page 42. There was a detailed surveyor's map of the rear of the property. A small, shaded rectangle was highlighted in red ink. Next to it, in Julian's handwriting, was a note. Phase 2. Parking structure and valet drop-off. I zoomed in on the shaded rectangle. The label was small, printed in faint text that he probably hoped the city council wouldn't notice. Cedar Grove Memorial Park. I gasped, dropping my water glass. It shattered on the floor, but I didn't even flinch. Cedar Grove wasn't a park. It was a cemetery. An old historic African-American burial ground dating back to the 1920s. It was overgrown now, yes, and often neglected by the city, but it was sacred ground. It was where the factory workers, the jazz musicians, and the civil rights activists of the last century were buried. It was where my grandfather was buried. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Julian knew this. He had to know. We had visited my grandfather's grave together 3 years ago. I had stood there and cried, clearing weeds from the headstone, and Julian had stood beside me holding my hand, pretending to care. He had stood on the very ground he was now planning to pave over for a valet parking lot. I read the demolition strategy. Julian's plan involved quietly petitioning the city to rezone the land as abandoned property, exhuming the remains without public notice, and moving them to a mass grave in a pauper's field 2 counties away. He wanted to turn the resting place of my ancestors into a place for his rich friends to park their Porsches. The sadness vanished instantly. It was incinerated by a white-hot rage that started in my stomach and shot through every vein in my body. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't just about a cheating husband or a stolen house. This was a violation of the dead. This was an act of cultural erasure so vile that it made me want to scream. I stared at Julian's signature at the bottom of the page. It was sweeping and arrogant, signed with a flourish. He thought he was a visionary. He thought he was building the future, but he was just a grave robber in a three-piece suit. I picked up my phone again. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of pure hatred. I didn't call Henderson. I called the lawyer who was acting as the registered agent for Otis Holdings. "Draft the contract," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stones. The lawyer hesitated. "Already. You haven't even met him. You haven't negotiated terms." "I don't need to meet him," I hissed. "Give him the money. Give him exactly what he asked for, $50 million. But I want a new clause added to the collateral agreement, Clause 33. "Clause 33? The lawyer asked, confused. "What is that?" "It is a strict timeline forfeiture," I said. "If the project is delayed by more than 48 hours. For any reason at all, the lender has the immediate right to seize all collateral, including the land, the permits, and his personal assets to cover the default. And set the interest rate at 15%. 15%. "That is predatory," the lawyer warned. "He will never sign that." "He will," I said, staring at the map of the cemetery. "He is desperate and he thinks he is untouchable. He thinks nothing can stop him. Send him the papers tonight. Tell him the offer expires at 8 a.m. tomorrow." I hung up the phone and walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the city. I looked at the spot across the river where the tower was supposed to rise. Julian was down there celebrating his genius, thinking he had found a savior in Otis Holdings. He didn't realize he had just shook hands with the devil. "You want to dig up my history, Julian," I whispered to the glass. "You want to bury my family under concrete? Go ahead. Sign the paper. Take the money, because I am not just going to take your building. I am going to bury you in the foundation." The crisp white pages of the loan agreement sat on the mahogany conference table like a stack of freshly fallen snow. To Julian, they looked like victory. To me, watching from the hidden camera feed in the lawyer's office, they looked like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. I sat in my hotel suite, a glass of water in my hand, my eyes glued to the screen of my laptop. The audio feed was crystal clear. I could hear the nervous tapping of Julian's expensive pen against the wood. I could hear the rustle of Brittany's silk dress as she shifted impatiently in her chair. They were sitting across from Mr. Finch, a high-priced corporate attorney I had hired to represent Otis Holdings. Finch was perfect for the role. He was older, stern, and spoke with a dry, boring monotone that made people want to skip the details just to get the meeting over with. "This is the standard financing agreement for the $50 million credit facility," Finch said, pushing the 3-inch stack of paper toward Julian. "As discussed with your broker, Otis Holdings is willing to expedite the funds immediately. However, given the high-risk nature of the development and the accelerated timeline you requested, there are strict covenants included." Julian waved his hand dismissively, flashing that charming, dangerous smile that had once fooled me. "I know how this works, Finch. I used to be a broker myself. Just show me where to sign. I have a demolition crew standing by and a city council member to take to lunch." Finch didn't smile. He flipped the document open to page 47. He pointed a manicured finger at a dense block of text in the middle of the page. It was Clause 33. I leaned closer to my screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. The poison pill. "I am legally required to draw your attention to the default provisions," Finch said, his voice flat. "Clause 33 stipulates that time is of the essence. Otis Holdings operates on a zero-tolerance policy for schedule slippage. If the Thorne Tower project is delayed by more than 48 hours for any reason whatsoever, including but not limited to labor disputes, weather, or municipal injunctions, the loan will be considered in technical default." Julian rolled his eyes, picking at a piece of lint on his jacket. Yeah, standard boilerplate. Every lender wants to ensure we stay on track." Finch continued, his voice getting slightly louder. "If a technical default occurs, the interest rate immediately jumps to a penalty rate of 200% per annum. Furthermore, and this is crucial, Mr. Thorne, the lender reserves the right to immediately seize all collateral to recover the principal. That includes the land, the existing structures, the permits, And as per the personal guarantee, you offered your private equity in the Thorne Real Estate Group. I held my breath. This was the moment. Any sane businessman would stop. Any rational human being would read that clause and realize it was a trap. 200% interest. Immediate seizure after a 2-day delay. It was financial suicide. It was a contract designed to fail. I watched Julian's face. For a split second, his eyebrows knitted together. He hesitated. The pen hovered over the paper. 200%, Julian asked, looking up. That seems excessive, doesn't it? Even for hard money. My stomach tightened. He was going to balk. He was going to read it. But then Brittany leaned over. She placed a hand on his forearm, her diamond bracelet sparkling under the fluorescent lights, the same bracelet he had bought with money from our joint account just before he filed for divorce. Baby, she whined, her voice grating and sweet. The wedding planner is calling me every 5 minutes. We need to put the deposit down on the venue in Lake Como by noon or we lose the date. And my dad is expecting you to announce the funding at the gala tonight. Do you really want to tell him you got cold feet because of some legal jargon? You are Julian Thorne. You never fail. You said this tower is going to be built in record time anyway, right? Julian looked at Brittany. Then he looked at his reflection in the glass partition of the conference room. He saw the powerful CEO. He saw the man who conquered Chicago. He didn't see the fool about to sign his life away. His ego swelled, pushing aside his caution. You are right, babe, Julian said, a smirk returning to his lips. He looked back at Finch. I never miss a deadline. This clause is irrelevant because I don't make mistakes. I am going to build this tower faster than anyone in the city has ever seen. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of his signature was the sweetest melody I had ever heard. He signed page 47, then page 48, then the personal guarantee. With every stroke of ink, he was tightening the noose around his own neck. He wasn't just signing a loan. He was signing a confession. He was handing me the legal right to take everything he had ever built the moment he slipped up. And I knew he would slip up, because I was going to be the one greasing the floor. Done, Julian declared, slamming the pen down. Transfer the funds. Finch nodded, closing the folder. A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Thorne. The wire transfer has been queued. You should see the funds in your operating account within the hour. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The tension drained out of me, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. It was done. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the snap. An hour later, my phone vibrated. I didn't need to look to know who it was, but I picked it up anyway. The screen flashed the name Julian. He hadn't deleted my number yet. He probably kept it just for moments like this. Moments when he needed to punch down to feel tall. I walked out onto the balcony of the Langham Hotel. The wind was whipping off the Chicago River, cold and bracing. Across the water, I could see the lights on the top floor of Julian's office building blazing. I swiped the green button and held the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. Camille, Julian's voice boomed through the speaker, loud and slightly slurred. He was already drinking. I hope you are sitting down, sweetheart. Actually, I don't care if you are sitting down. I just wanted to share some news. I stood silent, watching his silhouette in the window across the river. He was pacing back and forth, holding a glass of champagne. I just closed the deal of the century, he bragged. $50 million. Cash. Just like that. Remember when you said I was reckless? Remember when you said I leveraged too much? Well, guess what? The market loves me. Investors are lining up to throw money at me. I am going to build the tallest tower on the south side, and I am going to put my name on it in gold letters 10 feet high. I took a slow breath. The arrogance was suffocating. He really believed he had won. He had no idea that the investor he was bragging about was the woman he had discarded like trash. That sounds very impressive, Julian, I said, my voice calm, devoid of any emotion. It is not just impressive, it is historic. He laughed. And the best part, I'm going to use the profits to buy Brittany a villa in Italy. We are getting married in Como. You know the place you always wanted to go but we never could afford because you were always so worried about savings accounts and rainy days? Well, it is sunny over here, Camille. I looked down at the street below. The cars looked like toys. The people looked like ants. Is that all you called to say? I asked. No, he said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. I called to tell you that I won. You lost. You have nothing. No husband, no house, no money. You are a zero, Camille. And I am $50 million rich. I just wanted to make sure you knew that before I blocked this number forever. Goodbye, Camille. Enjoy your life in the gutter. He hung up. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. A smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who watches the prey walk blindly into the pit. He thought the 50 million was a prize. He didn't realize it was the bait. He didn't realize that the money came with strings, and those strings were wrapped around his throat. I looked at his window one last time. He was raising his glass in a toast to an empty room. Enjoy it, Julian, I whispered into the cold Chicago air. Drink your champagne. Plan your wedding. Because the clock starts ticking tomorrow morning. And 48 hours is not a lot of time when the world starts falling apart. I turned back into the room. I had work to do. I had a concrete supplier to buy. I had a union leader to call. I had a storm to manufacture. Julian wanted to build a tower fine. I was going to make sure he built it on quicksand. The $50 million wasn't a loan. It was the shovel he was going to use to dig his own grave. And I was going to be there to throw the first handful of dirt. The ink on the loan agreement was barely dry when Julian ordered the groundbreaking ceremony. It was exactly the kind of spectacle he lived for. He rented a massive tent, hired a catering crew to serve champagne at 9 in the morning, and invited every news outlet in Chicago. From the balcony of my hotel suite, through the lens of my high-powered binoculars, I watched him shovel a pile of ceremonial dirt while wearing a hard hat that cost more than a Honda Civic. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom. He was laughing, shaking hands with the mayor, and pointing up at the sky where his tower was supposed to pierce the clouds. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was about to become quicksand. While Julian was busy posing for photos, I was busy executing the first phase of my dismantling strategy. I wasn't at the ceremony. I was across town, sitting in a dusty wood-paneled office that smelled of stale coffee and diesel fumes. Across the desk sat Frank Miller, the owner of Miller Ready Mix, the largest concrete supplier in the South Side. Frank was a tired man. He had been running his fleet of mixer trucks for 30 years and he looked ready to retire. He was also the exclusive supplier for the Thorne Tower project. Julian had chosen Miller not because of loyalty, but because Frank was the only one with enough trucks to pour the massive foundation slab in a single continuous operation, which was a structural requirement for a building of that size. I didn't waste time with small talk. I placed a cashier's check on Frank's scarred wooden desk. The amount was 40% above market value for his entire company. Frank stared at the check, his eyes bulging. He looked at me, then back at the check. He didn't ask why a woman in a designer white suit wanted to buy a fleet of concrete mixers. He didn't care. He just saw a one-way ticket to a beach house in Florida. There is just one condition, Frank, I said, sliding the purchase agreement toward him. You stay on as a consultant for 1 week. And you take orders directly from me starting right now, specifically regarding the dispatch schedule for tomorrow morning. Frank signed the papers with a shaking hand. Done, he breathed out, looking like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. What do you need me to do, boss? I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. I need you to find a technical problem. A big one. The next morning, the sun rose over the construction site, promising a perfect day for building. The weather was clear, the wind was low, and the calendar said it was day 1 of the foundation pour. In the construction world, this is the most critical day. Once you start pouring concrete for a skyscraper's base, you cannot stop. It has to be a continuous flow to prevent cold joints, which are cracks that form where fresh concrete meets hardened concrete. If you stop in the middle, the foundation is ruined, and you have to jackhammer the whole thing out and start over. It costs millions. I stood on my balcony sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the scene unfold below. At 6 a.m., the site was buzzing. 200 workers were ready. The rebar was laid out like a massive steel skeleton. The pump trucks were positioned, their long booms extending into the air like hungry dinosaurs waiting to be fed. Julian arrived at 6:30 in his Bentley. He stepped out looking energized, wearing a safety vest over his Italian suit. He gathered his foreman, checking his watch, waiting for the parade of concrete mixers to arrive. 7 a.m. came. The streets remained empty. 7:15. Julian was pacing. I saw him pull out his phone and make a call. He was tapping his foot impatiently. 7:30. The site was silent. The pump trucks were idling, spewing exhaust but pumping nothing. The workers were standing around in clusters, smoking cigarettes, leaning on their shovels. The silence on a construction site is the most expensive sound in the world. Every minute of silence burns thousands of dollars in labor costs. I picked up my own phone and called Frank Miller. "Do it now," I said. Down on the street, Julian's phone rang. I could see him answer it aggressively. He put the phone to his ear, and even from 30 floors up, I could see his body language shift from annoyance to panic. "What do you mean, contaminated?" Julian screamed. His voice was so loud that some of the workers turned to look at him. "I ordered grade A structural mix. Wash the trucks out and send them." I listened to Frank on the other end, following my script perfectly. "I am sorry, Mr. Thorne. We found traces of sulfate in the aggregate supply this morning. It is a chemical reaction. If we pour this, the concrete will never cure. It will turn to dust in a month. I cannot legally send these trucks out. We have to purge the entire silo and source new gravel." "How long?" Julian roared, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "How long, Frank?" 48 hours minimum, Frank replied. "Maybe 72. We have to follow safety protocols." "No," Julian shouted, kicking a traffic cone so hard it flew across the sidewalk. "I don't have 48 hours. I have a contract. Get me concrete from somewhere else." "There is nobody else, Mr. Thorne," Frank said calmly. "Not for a pour this size. Not on this short notice. You know that. You insisted on the exclusive contract to get the bulk discount. We are your only supplier." Julian threw his phone onto the ground. It bounced on the asphalt, cracking the screen. He ran his hands through his hair, disheveling his perfect look. He spun around and grabbed his project manager by the vest. "Fix this!" Julian screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "Call every supplier in Illinois. I don't care if you have to drive a mixer truck yourself. Get me concrete now." The project manager held up his hands, terrified. "Boss, we can't. Even if we found another supplier, they need to certify the mix design with the city engineers. That takes a week. We are stuck. We have to wait for Miller." Julian froze. He stood there in the middle of his empty, silent construction site, surrounded by idle machines and confused workers. And in that moment, I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He wasn't thinking about the concrete. He was thinking about page 47 of the loan agreement. Clause 33. He looked at his watch. 8 a.m. The clock had officially started. I set my coffee cup down on the railing. I could feel the invisible timer ticking in the air between us. "Tick-tock, Julian. You have exactly 47 hours and 59 minutes before the interest rate triples. Before I own your land. Before I own you." Julian turned and looked up at the skyline as if looking for divine intervention. His eyes swept across the buildings, across the river. For a split second, his gaze lingered on the Langham Hotel. He couldn't see me hidden in the shadows of the balcony, but he could feel the pressure. He grabbed a megaphone from a nearby table and turned to the workers. "Nobody goes home," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Nobody leaves this site. We pour the second the trucks get here. If you leave, you are fired. Do you hear me? You are all fired." The workers looked at each other, confused and angry. They were union men. They got paid whether they poured or not. Julian was making enemies of the very people he needed to build his dream. I walked back into the suite and opened my laptop. I pulled up the Otis Holdings dashboard. I adjusted the status of the loan from active to pending default watch. The system highlighted the deadline in red. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day for you, husband," I whispered to the screen. I picked up the phone again and dialed the number for the local chapter of the Construction Workers Union. It was time to add a little more fuel to the fire. If Julian wanted to scream at his workers, he was about to find out that they had a voice too. And unlike him, they had solidarity. The first domino had fallen, the concrete was blocked, the clock was running. And Julian Thorne, the man who thought he could control everything, was about to learn that he couldn't even control the ground beneath his feet. The hunt was no longer just beginning. The trap had snapped shut. Now we were just waiting for the prey to stop thrashing. The engagement party was being held at the Drake Hotel in the Gold Coast Room, a venue so exclusive that the waiting list was usually 2 years. But Julian, flush with his new $50 million loan, had paid triple to bump a charity gala and secure the date. The theme was Midnight in Paris. The ballroom was draped in black velvet and twinkling fairy lights. There were ice sculptures of the Eiffel Tower waiters serving caviar on silver spoons, and a 12-piece orchestra playing soft jazz. It was a display of wealth so excessive it bordered on grotesque. I arrived at 9 p.m. sharp. I wasn't wearing black to blend in. I was wearing the crimson silk gown I had bought in Milan 3 years ago, but never had the occasion to wear because Julian always said it was too bold. Tonight bold was the point. The dress hugged every curve and trailed behind me like a river of blood. I wore the diamond earrings I had bought back from the pawn shop that afternoon. Yes, I had sent an assistant to reclaim them for double the price. They weren't just jewelry anymore. They were war trophies. When I walked through the double doors, the conversation in the room didn't just stop. It died. The music seemed to fade into the background. Heads turned. Whispers started. "Who is that? Is that Camille? She looks incredible. She looks dangerous." I walked straight toward the center of the room, my chin high, my eyes scanning the crowd until I found them. Julian and Brittany were holding court near the champagne tower. Julian was laughing at some joke, his hand resting possessively on Brittany's lower back. Brittany was glowing in a white lace dress that probably cost more than my parents' house. She looked happy. She looked victorious. Then she saw me. Her smile vanished instantly. She dropped her hand from Julian's arm and marched toward me, her face twisting into a mask of fury. Julian followed her, looking confused and annoyed. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brittany hissed, stopping 2 feet in front of me. She lowered her voice so the guests nearby couldn't hear, but the venom was palpable. "This is a private event. Did you sneak in through the kitchen? Or did you sleep with the bouncer? Get out before I have you thrown out." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I looked at her with a calm, pitying smile. "Hello, Brittany. You look lovely. White really is a brave choice for you, considering what she snapped, considering you are jealous, considering you are a bitter, washed-up ex-wife who can't let go." "Security." She raised her hand to signal a guard. Julian stepped up beside her, looking me up and down with a mixture of lust and irritation. "Seriously, Camille," he said, adjusting his tie. "You need to leave. We have important people here. My investors. My partners. You don't belong in this world anymore." I laughed softly. "Oh, Julian. You have no idea which world I belong to. But I didn't come to cause a scene. I came to deliver a gift." I reached into my crimson clutch. Brittany flinched as if she expected me to pull out a weapon. In a way, I was. I pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. I held it out to her. "A wedding gift," I said. "Open it. It might help with your vows." Brittany stared at the envelope. Curiosity warred with suspicion in her eyes. She snatched it from my hand. "If this is some kind of hate letter, I am going to sue you for harassment," she muttered, tearing the seal open. She pulled out the contents. It wasn't a letter. It was a stack of high-resolution photographs. I watched her face closely. I saw the color drain from her cheeks as she looked at the first photo. It showed her entering a Motel 6 on the outskirts of town, ironically the same chain I had slept in just days ago. But she wasn't alone. She was with a man. A very muscular man with a spray tan. She flipped to the second photo. It showed them kissing in the parking lot. She flipped to the third. It was taken through the window of the motel room. It left nothing to the imagination. Brittany's hands started to shake. She looked up at me, her blue eyes wide with terror. She quickly shoved the photos back into the envelope, crushing them against her chest. She looked around frantically to see if anyone had seen. Julian was busy waving to a city councilman across the room. He hadn't noticed. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have friends in low places," I lied. My private investigator, a retired cop named Sal, was actually very expensive but worth every penny. "What do you want?" Brittany hissed. "Money, is that it? You want blackmail money?" I stepped closer to her, leaning in so my lips brushed her ear. I smelled her fear. It was sweeter than the expensive perfume she wore. "I don't want your money, Brittany. I have plenty of my own now. I just want you to know that I know. I know you are not the perfect heiress you pretend to be. I know you are bored with Julian already. I know you are only marrying him because your daddy cut off your credit cards and you need Julian's new fortune to pay your gambling debts." Brittany froze. She hadn't expected me to know about the gambling. I pulled back and smiled at her. "Go ahead. Marry him. Rush to the altar. Because when the ship sinks, and trust me, it is sinking fast, you are going to be the one chained to the anchor." Brittany stared at me, her chest heaving. She looked at Julian, who was laughing loudly at his own joke. She looked at the envelope in her hand. For a second, I thought she might run. I thought she might confess. But then a hardened look came over her face. Self-preservation kicked in. She realized she was trapped. She needed Julian's money to fix her own mess. She couldn't leave him now. She shoved the envelope into her purse and straightened her spine. She forced a fake brittle smile onto her face. "You are lying," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You are just trying to scare me. It won't work. We are getting married next week. We are moving the date up, and once I have that ring on my finger, I will make sure you never set foot in this town again." I nodded slowly. "Good luck with that, Brittany. I really hope the wedding is worth it." I turned around and walked away, my red dress flowing behind me. I didn't stay for the cake. I didn't stay for the speeches. I had done what I came to do. I had planted the seed of panic. Brittany would now rush the wedding. She would push Julian to sign papers faster, to merge their assets quicker, to secure the bag before her secrets came out. She would become the catalyst for his destruction. As I walked out of the ballroom, I checked my watch. The 48-hour countdown on the concrete delay was ticking away. Julian was about to lose his project. And thanks to his lovely fiancée, he was about to lose his sanity too. The trap was tightening from both sides, and I was the only one holding the key. The sky over Chicago turned a bruised and angry purple as the storm front rolled in off Lake Michigan. From my vantage point in the presidential suite, the city looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for a disaster. But down on the construction site across the river, there was no stillness. There was only chaos. The 48-hour deadline I had buried in Clause 33 was ticking down like a bomb. Julian had exactly 4 hours left to show substantial progress on the foundation or face total default. But without concrete, he was paralyzed. Desperation makes men do dangerous things. Instead of accepting defeat and calling the lender to negotiate, Julian had decided to gamble with human lives. Through my binoculars, I watched him running between the idle machines, his expensive suit soaked through, his hair plastered to his skull. He was screaming at the foreman, pointing frantically at the upper levels of the steel scaffolding that had been erected for the support beams. The wind was gusting at 50 miles per hour. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick it looked like a gray curtain. No sane site manager would allow a crew up there in these conditions. It was a violation of every safety code in the book. But Julian wasn't a site manager anymore. He was a man trying to outrun his own ego. I saw him grab a radio and bellow into it. I couldn't hear him from this distance, but I didn't need to. I saw the reaction of the workers. They were shaking their heads, pointing at the swaying cranes, refusing to move. Julian grabbed a young worker by the safety vest, shoving him toward the ladder. He was forcing them to go up. He was forcing them to secure the rebar cages manually, trying to create the illusion of work being done so he could send a photo to Otis Holdings and claim the project was active. I put down my binoculars and picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the number for the city safety inspector. I had tipped him off an hour ago. I knew he was already en route, but he needed to get there fast. Julian was pushing his luck, and the laws of physics were not on his payroll. Suddenly, a gust of wind hit the site with the force of a freight train. The temporary lighting towers swayed violently. And then it happened. A sickening screech of metal shearing against metal echoed across the river, loud enough to penetrate the glass of my hotel room. The central section of the scaffolding, burdened by the weight of unsecured steel, and buffeted by the gale, buckled. I gasped, pressing my hand to the glass. The structure didn't collapse entirely, but it twisted, listing dangerously to the right. A load of steel rebar slid off the platform, crashing onto the concrete below with a thunderous boom that shook the ground. Dust and debris exploded into the air, mixing with the rain. I saw 3 workers dangling by their safety harnesses, swinging wildly in the wind, their feet kicking at empty air. Sirens began to wail immediately. Not the police sirens I had called, but the on-site emergency alarms. The strobe lights flashed red, painting the rain in streaks of blood. My heart was racing. I wanted Julian destroyed, yes. I wanted him bankrupt, but I didn't want blood on my hands. I watched as the other workers scrambled to pull their colleagues to safety. It took 5 agonizing minutes, but they managed to haul the men back onto the stable section of the platform. No one fell. No one died. But the damage was done. Julian stood in the center of the wreckage, staring at the twisted metal. He wasn't checking on his men, he was looking at his watch. He was realizing that the cleanup alone would take a week. Then the second wave of lights appeared. A convoy of white SUVs with the City of Chicago seal on the doors skidded to a halt at the main gate. The OSHA inspectors had arrived. They were followed by 2 police cruisers. I watched as the lead inspector, a man named Miller, who took his job very seriously, marched onto the site. He didn't even stop to talk to Julian. He walked straight to the twisted scaffold, took one look, and pulled a roll of thick red tape from his jacket. He began wrapping it around the gate. The red tag. The death sentence for any construction project. Julian ran toward him, waving his arms. I could see him pleading. I could see him pointing at the sky, blaming the weather, probably trying to offer a bribe. Miller just shook his head, handed Julian a clipboard with a citation, and signaled for the police to clear the site. Work stop order. Effective immediately. Indefinite duration. Pending full investigation. The site went dark as the power was cut. The workers grabbed their gear and ran for the gates, leaving Julian standing alone in the rain, clutching a wet piece of paper that told him his dream was over. I turned away from the window. It was time for the final nail. I sat down at the desk and opened the secure email server for Otis Holdings. The automated system had already flagged the project's status. Condition: critical failure. Reason: municipal injunction and safety violation. Status: technical default. I opened the drafted email I had prepared days ago. It was a formal notice of default and acceleration of debt. It was cold, legal, and absolute. It cited Clause 33. It stated that due to the cessation of work for more than 48 hours, which was now guaranteed by the government shutdown, the lender was exercising its right to immediate repayment. Since the borrower did not have $50 million in cash, the lender was seizing the collateral. I hit send. Across the river down in the mud, Julian's phone lit up in his pocket. He ignored it at first. He was too busy screaming at the retreating police cars. But then it buzzed again, and again. A courier notification, a lawyer's text, an email priority alert. He pulled the phone out. He wiped the rain from the screen. I watched through the binoculars as he read the message. I saw his knees buckle. He didn't fall, but he slumped, as if his skeleton had been removed. He dropped the phone into a puddle. He looked around the empty site at the red tape at the twisted steel. And then, he did something I hadn't seen him do in 10 years. He put his face in his hands and wept. But I felt no pity. Tears were just salt water. They wouldn't wash away what he had done. They wouldn't bring back the years he stole from me. They wouldn't save the cemetery he wanted to desecrate. I picked up the phone and called Henderson. "The default notice has been served," I said quietly. "I see it," Henderson replied. "The legal team is already filing the motion for title transfer. By tomorrow morning you will own the land, the equipment, and the shell of the building." "What about his personal assets?" I asked. "The personal guarantee is active," Henderson confirmed. "We have placed liens on his bank accounts, his stock portfolio, and his primary residence. He has frozen Camille. He can't buy a pack of gum." "Good," I said. "Send a crew to the site tomorrow. I want that red tape removed, but not for him. I want the site cleared. We are going to restore the park." I hung up and walked back to the window. The storm was breaking. The rain was slowing down. Julian was still standing there, a small, dark figure, in a wasteland of his own making. He had wanted to build a monument to himself. Instead, he had built a ruin. I finished the glass of wine I had poured hours ago. It was cold now, but it still tasted sweet. The hunt was over. The trap had worked perfectly. Now all that was left was the cleanup. And unlike Julian, I knew exactly how to clean up a mess. I was going to scrub his name off the city brick by brick. The city of Chicago was asleep, buried under a blanket of rain and darkness. But inside the penthouse office of the Thorne Real Estate Group, the lights were blazing. The air conditioning was set to 65 degrees, yet Julian Thorne was sweating through his second shirt of the night. He paced the length of the room, a glass of amber whiskey trembling in his hand. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows usually made him feel like a god looking down on his creation. But tonight, the city looked like a prison. The red tape wrapped around his construction site across the river was invisible in the dark, but he could feel it pulsating, a scarlet tourniquet cutting off the blood supply to his empire. 30 hours. That was all that remained of the 48-hour grace period I had strangled him with in Clause 33. He had spent the last 18 hours on the phone begging, threatening, and bribing. He had called the mayor, who didn't pick up. He had called his old fraternity brothers at the concrete supply firms, who suddenly had no trucks available. He had even called his father-in-law, Brittany's dad, asking for a bridge loan. The old man had laughed and hung up, muttering something about bad investments. Julian was alone. He was cornered. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind because it stops thinking about survival and starts acting on instinct. Brittany was sitting on the leather sofa scrolling through her phone. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't sweating. She was angry. To her, this wasn't a financial crisis. It was an inconvenience. It was a threat to the wedding of the century, which was supposed to happen in 6 days. She looked up at Julian, her eyes cold and calculating. "Stop pacing, Julian," she snapped, tossing her phone onto the cushion. "You are making me dizzy. And stop drinking. You need to fix this." "Fix it!" Julian spun around, his voice cracking. "How do you propose I fix it, Brittany?" "The city shut me down. The concrete is gone. And that shadow lender, Otis Holdings, is going to seize the property by tomorrow night if I don't show proof of solvency. They want $5 million in liquid reserves to lift the default notice. I have $200,000 in the operating account. I am done." Brittany stood up and walked over to him. She didn't offer comfort. She grabbed his lapels and pulled him down to her level. Her perfume was overpowering, masking the smell of the stale alcohol on his breath. "You are not done," she hissed. "You are Julian Thorne. You always have a move. Think. Where is the money? There has to be money somewhere." "There isn't," he shouted, pulling away. "It is all tied up in the land. It is all in the equity." "What about the other accounts?" Brittany asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What about the accounts you don't show the auditors? What about the pension fund?" Julian froze. He stared at her, his eyes wide with horror. The employee pension fund. It was a sacred trust. It held the retirement savings of over 200 workers, secretaries who had been with the company for 20 years, foremen who had broken their backs, building his towers, janitors who trusted him with their future. It contained over $8 million legally lockboxed and federally protected. "Are you insane?" Julian whispered. "That is a federal crime, Brittany. That is embezzlement. If I touch a cent of that money, I don't just lose the company, I go to prison for 20 years. Brittany rolled her eyes as if he were being dramatic about a parking ticket. "You are not stealing it, you idiot. You are borrowing it. You take the $5 million out tonight, wire it to the operating account, to satisfy the lender, get the red tape removed, and then once the construction loan unlocks the next tranche of funding next week, you put it back. No one will ever know. It is a bridge loan to yourself. But if I get caught," Julian stammered. "If you don't do it, you lose everything tomorrow," Brittany interrupted, her voice hard as diamond. "You lose the tower, you lose the house. And let me be very clear, Julian. You lose me. I am not marrying a bankrupt ex-CEO. I am not living in a rental apartment while you fight lawsuits. You fix this tonight, or I am on the first flight to Paris in the morning alone." She let go of his jacket and stepped back, crossing her arms. She had played her final card. She knew exactly what terrified Julian more than prison. It was irrelevance. It was poverty. It was being alone. Julian looked at her. He looked at the empty whiskey glass. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:30 in the morning. The auditors were asleep. The bank managers were asleep. The employees whose money he was about to steal were asleep in their modest homes, dreaming of a retirement he was about to jeopardize. He walked to his desk. He sat down in his heavy leather chair. His hands were shaking so badly, he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. He woke up his computer. The blue light of the monitor washed over his face, making him look pale and corpse-like. He opened the secure banking portal. Across the river, in the darkness of the presidential suite, I was wide awake. I was sitting in the dark, the only light coming from my own laptop screen. I wasn't drinking whiskey. I was drinking water. I was sober, alert, and waiting. When Julian had signed the loan agreement with Otis Holdings, he had been so focused on the interest rate and the timeline that he hadn't noticed the reporting requirements in the appendix. Clause 47 mandated that the lender serve as a silent auditor with view-only access to all financial accounts associated with the Thorne Real Estate Group to monitor fiscal health. He had given me the keys to his entire financial life, thinking I was just some passive investor in the Caymans. I saw the notification pop up on my dashboard. Active session, Julian Thorne, admin terminal. I clicked on the live monitoring stream. I watched his mouse move across the screen. I saw him bypass the operating account. I saw him bypass the payroll account. I saw the cursor hover over the folder labeled TREG, Employee Pension Trust, Restricted Access. "Don't do it, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. "Don't be the monster I think you are. Walk away." But I knew he wouldn't. I knew him better than he knew himself. He was weak, and weak men will burn the whole world down to keep themselves warm. On his screen, a security prompt appeared. "Enter administrator override key." I watched as he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a physical RSA token. He typed in the 6-digit code. The screen flashed green. Access granted. Brittany was standing behind him now, her hand on his shoulder, massaging the tension. "Do it," she urged. "Just $5 million. It is nothing." Julian typed in the transfer amount. 5 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Destination General Operating Account. Memo Interdepartmental Liquidity Transfer. His finger hovered over the enter key. He took a breath. A shaky, ragged breath that I could almost hear through the internet connection. He closed his eyes, and then he pressed it. Processing. Transaction complete. The screen flashed a confirmation number. Julian slumped back in his chair, exhaling a long, shuddering sob. He had done it. He had crossed the line from businessman to criminal. Brittany kissed the top of his head, whispering praises, telling him he was a genius, a survivor. I didn't blink. I didn't celebrate. I simply moved my mouse to the top right corner of my screen, where the screen recording software had been running for the last 10 minutes. I clicked Stop Recording. Save File. I named it The End. I had him. I had everything. The video showed the login, the specific account selection, the override code, and the illegal transfer. It was irrefutable proof of wire fraud and embezzlement. I didn't need to seize his building anymore. The FBI would do that for me. I didn't need to ruin his reputation. He had just sold it for $5 million. I picked up my phone. I didn't call the police yet. That would be too quick. I wanted him to wake up tomorrow thinking he had won. I wanted him to feel that brief, fleeting moment of relief before the hammer came down. I sent the video file to Mr. Henderson at the bank with a simple note attached. Freeze everything at 8 o'clock a.m. Notify the federal authorities at 8:05 a.m. I closed my laptop. The city outside was still raining, washing the streets clean, but in that penthouse across the river, the stain was permanent. Julian Thorne had just dug his own grave, and he had used the retirement savings of his own people to buy the shovel. The trap had snapped shut, and the sound was deafening. I stood up and walked to the bedroom. For the first time in a week, I was going to sleep peacefully. The hunt was over. Tomorrow, we skin the prey. The Cook County Courthouse was a place where dreams went to die, usually buried under mountains of paperwork and the drone of legal jargon. But today, Courtroom 4B felt less like a hall of justice and more like a gladiatorial arena. The air conditioning was humming, but the tension in the room made the air feel thick and suffocating. Julian sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every inch the wronged billionaire. He was wearing his best charcoal suit, the one he saved for board meetings and press conferences. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set in a line of righteous indignation. To the casual observer, he looked like a captain of industry fighting off a shark. Only I knew he was just a drowning man trying to pull everyone else down with him. Beside him sat Arlington Vance, the most expensive corporate litigator in Chicago. Vance was a shark in human skin, a man who charged $1,200 an hour to destroy reputations. Julian had liquidated his last personal savings bond to pay the retainer. It was his final gamble. He was betting everything on the idea that Otis Holdings was a fraudulent shell company, a ghost that would vanish under the bright lights of a courtroom. He believed that if he screamed loud enough about conspiracy and bad faith, the judge would void the loan, lift the construction halt, and give him back his tower. He was wrong. I was not in the room yet. I was waiting in the holding area, watching the proceedings on a closed-circuit monitor. I watched as Judge Eleanor Banks, a woman known for her zero-tolerance policy on corporate foolishness, banged her gavel to bring the room to order. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, peering over her spectacles, "you have filed an emergency injunction against Otis Holdings and Sterling Bank, alleging predatory lending practices, tortious interference, and fraud. Those are serious accusations. I hope you have the evidence to back them up, or I will hold you in contempt for wasting the court's time." Vance stood up, buttoning his jacket. He smoothed his silver hair and walked toward the bench with the confidence of a man who owned the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the silence. "My client, Mr. Julian Thorne, is a visionary. He is attempting to revitalize an underserved community on the South Side. He secured funding in good faith. But what he received was not a loan. It was a trap. Otis Holdings is not a legitimate investment firm. It is a predatory shell entity designed for one purpose: to manufacture a default and steal a $50 million asset. Vance turned to point a dramatic finger at the empty defense table where only Mr. Finch, my lawyer, sat quietly. Look at the defense, Your Honor. Where is the CEO of Otis Holdings? Where is the board of directors? They are phantoms. They hide in the Cayman Islands. They hide behind layers of bureaucracy because they know their contract is unconscionable. They used a weather delay and act of God to trigger a seizure clause that is illegal in 40 states. We demand that the default be vacated immediately and that the identity of this shadow investor be revealed. Julian nodded vigorously from his seat. He leaned over and whispered something to Brittany, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery. She looked pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. She knew about the embezzlement. She knew the walls were closing in, but she was clinging to the hope that Vance could perform a miracle. Judge Banks looked at Mr. Finch. "Counselor," she said, "do you have a response? And more importantly, where is your client? I will not preside over a case involving a ghost. If the principal of Otis Holdings does not appear to testify regarding the intent of the contract, I will be inclined to grant the plaintiff's motion." Mr. Finch stood up slowly. He didn't look worried. He checked his watch. "Your Honor," he said softly, "my client is not a ghost. My client is a citizen of Chicago with a vested interest in the integrity of the banking system. The principal is entering the building as we speak." Julian scoffed loud enough for the microphone to catch it. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He didn't believe it. He thought it was a stalling tactic. He turned to Brittany and smirked, mouthing the words, "We got them." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom remained closed. The seconds ticked by. The silence stretched thin, becoming uncomfortable. Judge Banks looked at the clock. "I will give you 1 minute, Mr. Finch," she warned, "if your client is not through those doors." And then the sound happened. It wasn't a bang. It was the rhythmic, sharp click of high heels on the marble floor of the hallway outside. Click, 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 slow, deliberate, authoritative. The sound grew louder. Everyone in the gallery turned their heads. Julian frowned, twisting in his seat to look at the entrance. The clicking stopped right outside the double doors. The handle turned. The doors swung open with a heavy groan. I stepped into the courtroom. I was not wearing the mud-stained rags from the rainy night Julian threw me out. I was not wearing the sensible beige cardigans of the librarian wife he had grown bored of. I was wearing the white suit, the $4,000 Milan masterpiece that fit me like armor. It was pristine, blindingly white under the courtroom lights, a stark contrast to the dark wood and gray suits of the lawyers. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. My makeup was flawless. And on my face I wore an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. A gasp rippled through the gallery. It started from the back and moved forward like a wave. Julian's reaction was visceral. He didn't just look surprised. He looked like he had been shot. The smirk slid off his face, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of confusion. He blinked rapidly as if his brain was refusing to process the visual information. He started to stand up, his legs hitting the table with a thud. "Camille," he whispered. The word was barely a breath, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a scream. Brittany let out a small shriek, covering her mouth with her hand. She shrank back into the wooden bench, trying to make herself invisible. I didn't look at them, not yet. I walked down the center aisle, my eyes fixed on the judge. Every step was a statement. I was walking through the wreckage of my old life and claiming my new one. I reached the gate that separated the gallery from the court. I pushed it open. I walked past Julian's table. I could smell his cologne, the scent of arrogance and fear. I could feel his eyes boring into the side of my head. "That is my wife," Julian stammered, grabbing his lawyer's arm. "Why is she here? Get her out of here. She is crazy. She is just here to cause a scene." Mr. Vance looked confused. He looked at me, then at his client. "Mr. Thorne, sit down," he hissed. I reached the defense table and stood next to Mr. Finch. I placed my black leather clutch on the table. Inside was the USB drive containing the video of the embezzlement. But that was for later. Right now, this was about identity. Judge Banks looked down at me from the bench. She frowned, looking between me and Julian. "Order," she barked. "Madam, who are you?" "This is a closed hearing for the parties involved in the suit against Otis Holdings. If you are a spectator, take a seat in the back. If you are a witness, wait outside until called." I looked up at the judge. I didn't speak immediately. I let the moment hang in the air. I turned my head slowly to the left, locking eyes with Julian. His face was gray. He was shaking his head, mouthing the word "no" over and over again. He was starting to understand. The pieces were clicking into place. The sudden funding, the strange clauses, the concrete delay, the impossible knowledge of his secrets. I turned back to the judge. I cleared my throat. My voice was clear, steady, and loud enough to reach the back row. "Your Honor, I am not a spectator, and I am not a witness." I placed my hand on the defense table, claiming the space. "My name is Camille Thorne. I am the sole proprietor and majority shareholder of Otis Holdings. I am the lender. I am the investor. And I am the woman who owns the debt that Mr. Thorne is trying to run away from." The silence that followed was total. It was the kind of silence that happens after a bomb detonates before the shockwave hits. Julian let out a strangled noise, something between a laugh and a sob. "No," he yelled, jumping to his feet. "That is a lie. She is broke. I threw her out with nothing. She pawned her ring for a sandwich. She is a librarian. She doesn't have $50 million. Mr. Vance tried to pull him down, but Julian shoved him away. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Arrest her. She is lying to the court. She is insane." Judge Banks banged her gavel so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "Mr. Thorne, sit down, or I will have you shackled." I didn't move. I didn't flinch at his outburst. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the black metal card. I held it up. The light caught the embossed numbers. "I assure you, Your Honor," I said calmly, "the money is very real. And so is the default. Mr. Thorne signed a contract with my company. He borrowed my money. He failed to meet my terms. And now I am here to collect what is mine." Julian collapsed back into his chair. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years. He didn't see the wife he had discarded. He saw the executioner. And he realized with a dawn of horror that the axe was already falling. The courtroom erupted into chaos the moment I revealed my identity. It was not the polite murmur of a gallery surprised by a twist. It was the roar of a crowd witnessing a public execution. Julian did not just stand up, he scrambled onto his chair, his face turning a violent shade of purple, his eyes bulging as if the pressure inside his head was about to explode. He pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming over the sound of the judge's gavel. "She is a liar. Look at her. That is my ex-wife. She is a librarian. She fixes old books for $12 an hour. She does not have $50 million. She does not even have a car. This is a trick. She is mocking this court." Mr. Vance. His high-priced lawyer was pulling at Julian's jacket, trying to force him back into his seat, hissing at him to shut up. But Julian was beyond legal counsel. He was in the grip of a narcissistic collapse. His reality, the one where he was the king and I was the peasant, was shattering, and he was clawing at the pieces. "She is a fraud," Julian bellowed, his voice cracking. "She pawned her wedding ring last week. I saw her. I saw her begging for money. Arrest her for perjury." Judge Banks slammed her gavel down with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot, silencing the room instantly. Two bailiffs took a step toward Julian, their hands resting on their belts. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge commanded, her voice icy and dangerous. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." She turned her gaze to me. It was a piercing, analytical look. "You made a very bold claim, Ms. Thorne. You claim to be the financier behind Otis Holdings. You claim to possess assets that exceed the GDP of some small countries. Do you have proof, or should I have you escorted to a holding cell? I did not speak. I simply nodded to Mr. Finch. My lawyer opened his briefcase. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper. He pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio bearing the seal of the Federal Reserve and the gold-embossed logo of Sterling Bank. He walked to the bench and handed it to the judge. "State certified proof of funds, Your Honor," Finch said calmly. Along with the articles of incorporation for Otis Holdings listing Camille Thorne as the sole beneficiary and signatory. And finally, a notarized letter from Charles Henderson, director of Sterling Bank, verifying the liquidity of the funds used for the loan in question. The room held its breath as Judge Banks opened the portfolio. Julian was panting, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the judge's face, desperate for her to laugh, desperate for her to throw the papers back at me. Judge Banks adjusted her glasses. She read the first page, then the second. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She flipped to the bank statement. She paused. She looked up at me, then back at the number, then at me again. The skepticism vanished from her eyes, replaced by a look of profound respect. "The court accepts these documents as valid," Judge Banks announced, her voice ringing clear. "The record will show that Camille Thorne is indeed the principal of Otis Holdings with verified liquid assets in excess of $140 million. The plaintiff's assertion that the lender is a fraudulent entity is hereby dismissed with prejudice." Julian made a sound like a wounded animal. "No," he wheezed. "That is impossible. The money." "Where did she get the money?" "It is my money. She must have stolen it from me." I turned to look at him. I spoke softly, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard. "It is not your money, Julian. It never was. It is the legacy of a man you called a lowly security guard. It is the legacy you tried to pave over with a parking lot." Mr. Vance stood up, trying to salvage the sinking ship. "Your Honor, even if Miss Thorne has the funds, this proves our point. This is a personal vendetta. She acted in bad faith. She engineered the default to harm my client personally. This is malice, not business. We moved to void the default based on conflict of interest." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. I walked to the center of the courtroom. "Conflict of interest?" I asked. "Mr. Vance, I am a lender. I entered into a contract. Your client violated the terms. But if you want to talk about bad faith, if you want to talk about malice, let us look at what your client did when the pressure was on." I nodded to Mr. Finch again. He connected his laptop to the court's audio-visual system. A large projection screen descended from the ceiling behind the judge. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "Your Honor," I said, addressing the judge. "The plaintiff claims he is a victim of a strict timeline. He claims he is an honest businessman who just needed a little more time. But the evidence will show that Mr. Thorne is not a victim. He is a criminal." I pressed the spacebar on the laptop. The screen flickered to life. It was the security footage from Julian's office. The timestamp in the corner read 2:30 a.m., 2 nights ago. The resolution was crystal clear. It showed Julian sitting at his desk, sweating, looking terrified. It showed Brittany standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder, urging him on. The courtroom gasped. I saw Brittany sitting in the front row cover her mouth with both hands. Beside her sat her father, Mr. Sinclair, a titan of Chicago industry, a man who prided himself on integrity. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. On the video, the audio was crisp. "Do it, Julian." Brittany's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "Just take the $5 million. It is nothing. Put it back next week. No one will know." "That is a lie," Julian screamed, jumping up. "That is deepfake. That is a—" "I sit down," the judge roared. On the screen, Julian typed on his keyboard. The camera zoomed in on his monitor, capturing every pixel. The audience watched as he logged into the restricted account. They read the words clearly: TREG, Employee Pension Trust. They watched him override the security warnings. They watched him transfer $5 million of his employees' retirement savings into his general operating account. Transaction complete. The video ended with Julian slumping back in his chair, sobbing, while Brittany kissed his head and told him he was a genius. The screen went black. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence. Then a heavy thud broke the spell. In the front row, Mr. Sinclair, Brittany's father, had collapsed. He clutched his chest, his face gray, gasping for air. The realization that his daughter was a co-conspirator in a federal crime and that his future son-in-law was a thief who had destroyed the family reputation was too much for his heart. Daddy Brittany screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Help someone, help him! Medics!" the judge shouted, pointing to the gallery. As the paramedics rushed in, chaos erupted. But amidst the noise, Judge Banks turned her fury on Julian. She did not look like a judge anymore. She looked like the wrath of God. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice shaking with anger, "you came into my courtroom claiming equity. You came here asking for justice, and you brought me evidence of wire fraud and embezzlement." Julian stood alone at his table. "Mr. Vance had stepped away from him, physically distancing himself from the radioactive fallout. Julian looked at me. His eyes were pleading. He mouthed my name. "Camille, please." I looked at him. I felt nothing. No love, no hate, just the finality of a task completed. "Bailiffs," Judge Banks ordered. "Take him into custody. I am revoking bail. I am referring this matter immediately to the district attorney and the FBI." 2 large officers moved in. They didn't ask him to put his hands behind his back. They grabbed him. They spun him around. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest thing in the room. Click, click, click. Julian began to cry. Not the fake tears he used to manipulate me. Ugly, terrified sobs. "I didn't do it. She made me do it." He pointed at Brittany, who was sobbing over her unconscious father. It was her idea. The bailiffs dragged him toward the side door. As he passed me, he stopped fighting. He slumped in their grip, looking at me with dead eyes. "Why?" he whispered. "Because, Julian," I said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You forgot the first rule of banking. Always read the fine print." The door slammed shut behind him. The judge banged her gavel one last time, dismissing the case. I stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. I picked up my clutch. I smoothed my white suit. I turned and walked out of the courtroom into the bright light of the hallway, leaving the shadows behind me forever. The paramedics were trying to put an oxygen mask on Mr. Sinclair, but the old man fought them off with the last of his strength. He struggled to his feet, his face ashen but his eyes burning with the fury of a patriarch whose legacy had just been stained. Brittany reached for him, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "Daddy, please," she sobbed, grabbing his sleeve. "You have to fix this. Call the governor. Call someone. Tell them it was a mistake. Mr." Sinclair looked at her hand on his arm as if it were a poisonous spider. He pulled away violently, causing Brittany to stumble back in her high heels. "Do not touch me," he spat, his voice weak but cutting through the noise of the courtroom. "You stood there and watched him steal from working people. You encouraged him. You are not a Sinclair. You are a common thief." "Daddy, no," Brittany wailed, realizing her safety net was vanishing. "The engagement is over," Mr. Sinclair announced, turning his back on her. "I am removing you from the family trust effective immediately. You want money? Go ask your fiancé. Oh wait, he doesn't have any." As Mr. Sinclair was escorted out by the medics, Brittany stood alone, trembling. She looked around the room, her eyes darting toward the exit. She took a step, then broke into a run, heading for the side door. She didn't get far. 2 men in dark suits stepped out from the gallery, blocking her path. They weren't bailiffs. They were federal agents. "Brittany Sinclair," one of them said, flashing a badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aiding and abetting a felony." She screamed as they grabbed her wrists. It was a high, piercing sound of a spoiled child realizing for the first time that actions had consequences. They cuffed her hands behind her back, the metal biting into her skin, ruining the expensive dress she had worn to celebrate her victory. I turned my attention back to Julian. The bailiffs were dragging him toward the holding cell door, but he dug his heels into the carpet. He wasn't looking at the judge or his lawyer. He was looking at me. His face was a mask of sheer terror. The arrogance was gone. The charm was gone. All that was left was a desperate, pathetic man who realized he had thrown away the only person who ever truly loved him. "Camille," he screamed, fighting against the guards. "Camille, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. We can fix this. I still love you. I never wanted this. Please, baby, don't let them take me." I stood perfectly still. The flashbulbs from the press area started to pop, illuminating the room in blinding bursts of white light. The reporters had smelled blood and managed to push into the hallway, snapping photos through the open doors. Julian's eyes locked onto mine, begging for a shred of mercy. He wanted me to save him. He wanted me to be the dutiful wife one last time. I looked at him, and for a moment the room seemed to go quiet. I remembered the rain. I remembered the mud on my face. I remembered him laughing on the porch with a glass of wine while I walked 5 miles to a motel. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked at him with absolute indifference, as if he were a stranger I had never met. Then I turned my back. "No!" Julian shrieked as the bailiffs finally shoved him through the door. "Camille." The door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet. I adjusted the lapel of my white suit, picked up my bag, and walked toward the main exit. As I stepped into the hallway, a wall of reporters surged forward, shouting questions, their cameras clicking furiously. They wanted a quote. They wanted the story of the scorned wife who became a tycoon. I didn't stop. I put on my sunglasses, shielding my eyes from the flashbulbs, and walked through the crowd like a ghost. I left the chaos behind me, the sound of Brittany's weeping and Julian's screams fading into the distance. The air outside was crisp and clean. It tasted like freedom. 30 days had passed since the gavel fell in that courtroom, sealing the fate of the Thorne empire. The foreclosure auction of our former marital home was a quiet affair. With Julian's assets frozen and the property tied to the embezzlement scandal, no respectable investor wanted to touch it. I stood in the back of the auction hall, hidden behind dark sunglasses, and raised my paddle one time. I bought the mansion, the furniture, and the memories for a fraction of what they were worth. It was the final transaction in my acquisition of his life. I pulled my new Mercedes into the long, winding driveway. The sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. It was a stark contrast to the storm that had raged the night I left. The house looked exactly the same, imposing, grand, and cold. But the man sitting on the front steps was unrecognizable. Julian was sitting on his suitcase, the same expensive leather bag he used to carry through airports like a trophy. Now it was scuffed and dirty. He was out on bail for 24 hours to collect his personal effects before his trial began. He was wearing the same suit he had worn in court, but it was wrinkled and stained. He hadn't shaved in weeks. He looked 20 years older. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. When he heard the crunch of my tires on the gravel, he looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He watched me step out of the car. I was wearing a simple beige trench coat and holding a small plastic bodega bag. I walked up the steps, stopping 2 feet away from him. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a quiet, heavy sense of closure. "Camille," he rasped. His voice was a dry, broken whisper. He tried to stand up, but his legs were shaky. He had to grab the railing for support. "Camille, thank God." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. They took everything he said, his voice trembling. The lawyers took the last of the cash. Brittany took the jewelry and ran before the feds caught her. "I have nothing, Camille. They froze my cards. I can't even buy a ticket to get to my sister's house in Detroit. She is the only one who will take me in." He took a step towards me, reaching out a shaking hand. Please, I know I don't deserve it, but can you loan me $100 just for the bus? I swear I will pay you back. I will work. I will do anything. Just $100. I looked at his outstretched hand. It was the same hand that had pointed at the door. It was the same hand that had signed the fraudulent transfer. It was the hand of a man who had never known what it meant to be truly hungry until this moment. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I didn't pull out a stack of cash. I held out the small white plastic bag I was carrying. Julian looked at it confused. He took it slowly, peering inside. Inside was a single foil-wrapped turkey sandwich from the gas station down the road, and tucked underneath it was a crumpled $20 bill. He stared at the contents. He looked up at me, his face crumbling. "This is," he stammered. "This is what Brittany gave you." I nodded slowly. "A sandwich and $20. It is enough for a bus ticket if you take the local route. It is enough to keep you alive for a day. That is what you left me with, Julian. And I survived. Now it is your turn." I walked past him, pulling the heavy brass keys from my pocket. I unlocked the massive oak double doors. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed in the silence. I pushed the door open, revealing the grand foyer that was finally truly mine. I turned back to him one last time. He was clutching the plastic bag to his chest, tears streaming down his face into his unkempt beard. "One more thing, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of anger. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for a second. "Don't use this entrance," I said, pointing to the driveway. "The movers are coming in an hour to clear out your things. Use the service gate around the back. The front door is for the homeowner." I stepped inside and closed the heavy door. Through the wood, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of a man falling to his knees and wailing. It was a sound of absolute regret. I locked the deadbolt, walked into the center of the foyer, and for the first time in 10 years, I took a deep, full breath. The air smelled clean. The house that Julian built to intimidate the world had become a sanctuary. The iron gates that once slammed shut on me were now always open, welcoming a steady stream of women who had been broken by the world and were looking for a place to heal. I walked through the grand foyer, the clicking of my heels echoing on the marble, but the sound was no longer lonely. It was accompanied by the hum of conversation, the ringing of phones, and the laughter of children playing in the garden. I had turned the mansion into the headquarters of the Otis Foundation. We offered legal aid to women going through high-conflict divorces. We provided seed capital for female entrepreneurs who had been rejected by traditional banks. We created a space where your worth was not determined by your husband's bank account or your dress size. I walked past the dining room where Julian used to host his stuffy dinner parties. It was now a conference room. A group of young women were sitting around the table brainstorming ideas for a tech startup. They looked up and smiled as I passed. I smiled back. This was the real legacy. This was what money was supposed to do. It wasn't meant to build towers that scraped the sky. It was meant to build foundations that lifted people up. I walked out to the driveway, pausing at the exact spot where I had fallen in the mud that rainy night. The mud was gone, replaced by a bed of resilient white hydrangeas. I stood there for a moment, remembering the girl who had cried there. She felt like a distant relative, a ghost from a past life. I didn't pity her anymore. I admired her. She had survived so that I could live. I got into my car and drove out of the city, heading west toward the quiet hills where my father was buried. The drive was peaceful. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me that I needed. Julian was in prison awaiting trial. Brittany was under house arrest. The Thorne Tower was being dismantled, the steel recycled, to build a community center and a park. The noise of their destruction had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of my engine. I pulled into the cemetery and walked up the grassy hill to the simple gray stone marker. Otis Thorne. Beloved father, guardian. I sat down on the grass beside him. The wind was gentle, rustling the leaves of the oak tree he had chosen for his resting place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the black metal card. It was lighter now, or maybe I had just grown stronger. I had transferred the remaining funds into a protected trust for the foundation. The card was empty. It was just a piece of metal again. A souvenir of a war that was finally over. I placed the card on top of the cold stone. The sun caught the embossed numbers, making them shine one last time. "You were right, Dad," I whispered to the wind. "You told me not to use it for greed. You told me to use it for survival. I did. But you also taught me something else, something I didn't understand until today." I traced the letters of his name on the stone. I used to think that revenge was about making them hurt the way they hurt me. I wanted to see Julian cry. I wanted to see Brittany lose everything. And I did see those things. But that wasn't the victory. The victory wasn't their fall. It was my rise. The victory is that I wake up in the morning and I don't think about them. The victory is that I am building something that will last longer than their lies. I stood up, brushing the grass from my coat. I am not the victim anymore, Dad. And I am not the avenger. I am just Camille. And for the first time in my life, that is enough. I left the card there, a final offering to the man who saved me. I walked back to my car, my steps light and sure. I started the engine and turned onto the highway facing the setting sun. The sky was a masterpiece of purple and gold, painting the horizon with the promise of tomorrow. I rolled down the windows, letting the air rush in, messing up my hair. I didn't care. I turned up the radio and pressed the accelerator. I wasn't running away from anything. I was driving toward everything. The road ahead was wide open and the steering wheel was in my hands. I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached my eyes. I was free. This story serves as a powerful reminder that your value is never defined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to stand up for yourself when the world tries to knock you down. Camille's journey teaches us that true power isn't about hoarding wealth or seeking petty revenge. It is about using your resources to build a legacy of kindness and strength. It shows that while we cannot control the betrayal of those we love, we have absolute control over how we rewrite our ending. The greatest revenge is simply moving on and thriving. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from scratch, or found strength you didn't know you had, I want to hear your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our community of survivors and thrivers. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that rock bottom is just the solid foundation where they will build their new empire. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are the author of your own story. Make the next chapter legendary.